"Hey man, it would be better if you get up from here, otherwise it won't be good for you." Who knew what was about to happen on the plane today? The flight attendant did this, and the passengers looked at her with a lot of anger. The flight attendant treated a man like this, and because of that, the man revealed his name and shocked everyone. What happened next? To find out, make sure to subscribe to my channel. It was a chilly morning in March 2024, and the cabin of a high-end airline was as polished and immaculate as always. The hum of the engines was a constant, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Amongst the passengers, one man sat alone, an outcast in his simple attire, a stark contrast to the suits and lavish dresses around him. His hands rested calmly on his lap, eyes fixed ahead, not engaging with anyone. The flight attendant, an American woman, walked briskly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers with practiced ease. But as she passed by this man, her expression faltered. Something about his presence bothered her. She glanced at his clothes, the worn-out jacket, and the faded jeans. There was no mistaking it. This man was out of place. To her, he was nothing more than a poor soul who had somehow found his way onto this flight. She stopped in front of him and, without thinking, spoke in a sharp tone. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her words cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "You're not dressed appropriately for this airline. Your attire goes against our dress code policy. You should really consider changing before flying with us again." The man didn't respond, his gaze unwavering. He remained seated, his silence almost unnerving. The flight attendant's face tightened as she continued. "These seats are reserved for wealthy families, not people like you. Do you even know where you are? This isn't some budget airline." Her words dripped with disdain, her mind already filled with judgmental thoughts about his appearance. She had no idea who he was, but in her world, people like him had no place in such an exclusive setting. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and the tension between them was palpable. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared speak out. They were silent observers, too focused on their own lives to intervene in this exchange. The flight attendant, seeing the lack of response, grew agitated. Without a second thought, she reached out and ripped the man's jacket sleeve with a swift motion, an act of aggression masked as a reprimand. Gasps filled the air. Some passengers took out their phones, recording the scene in disbelief. The man remained calm, his eyes still fixed forward, the only sign of his discomfort being the slight tightening of his jaw. The silence of the cabin seemed to grow louder. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But then, to everyone's surprise, the man did something unexpected. He picked up the phone on the armrest and calmly called for assistance. The tension in the cabin thickened as the flight attendant's sharp words hung in the air like a cloud of disdain. The passengers, most of whom were seated comfortably in their luxurious first-class seats, exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one dared to speak up. All eyes were on the scene unfolding between the man and the flight attendant. The man, who had been the target of the flight attendant's judgmental words, remained eerily calm. His face betrayed no emotion. His hands rested on his lap, his posture impeccable, but his silence seemed to fill the entire space. It was as though the hum of the plane had quieted, every sound now dwarfed by the palpable discomfort surrounding him. The flight attendant, on the other hand, was visibly irritated, her impatience rising with every passing second. The flight attendant's gaze flickered from the man's unremarkable attire to the empty first-class seats, almost as if she was expecting the man to realize the disparity between his appearance and the wealthier passengers seated around him. Her eyes narrowed, and with a mixture of arrogance and anger, she stood before him, her voice a bit sharper than before. "Listen," she began, her words now bordering on condescending. "You're not dressed appropriately for this airline. We have a policy that requires passengers to dress in a way that reflects the quality and class of our service. Look at you. You're a mess. Your clothes, well, they're far below our standards. This is a premium flight, not a bus ride, and frankly, you don't belong in this section." The man didn't flinch, He didn't react. He just sat there, unbothered. His eyes, still locked straight ahead, betrayed no sense of discomfort or anger. His silence, however, spoke volumes. The flight attendant, feeling the need to drive her point home, continued without hesitation. "These seats," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "are reserved for families who can afford them. Families who understand the finer things in life, not someone like you. Do you even know how lucky you are to be on this flight? It's meant for people who have earned their place here. People who don't look like, well, like you." Her words, which had initially been directed at him, seemed to spill out in a torrent of judgment, as if all her personal frustrations were being released in that one moment. She didn't know who he was, nor did she seem to care. He was just another poor soul in her eyes. A man who didn't fit the image of the typical first-class passenger. The man remained seated, unmoving. His expression stayed neutral, though his calmness contrasted sharply with the flight attendant's increasingly erratic behavior. She looked around, clearly expecting some support from the other passengers, but everyone else was either too stunned or too uncomfortable to speak up. Then, as if to assert her dominance, the flight attendant made an impulsive decision. She reached forward, grabbing a handful of the man's jacket and pulling at it, tearing part of the sleeve in a show of power, as if to reinforce her earlier statement. She seemed to relish the feeling of control, as though punishing him for being out of place was a justified act. The sound of fabric ripping echoed in the cabin. Some passengers gasped, others immediately pulled out their phones, recording the scene. But despite the growing tension, there was an unsettling silence from the rest of the passengers. No one intervened. Everyone remained passive, as if watching a train wreck unfold, but feeling too powerless to do anything about it. The man, however, did not rise to the bait. He simply adjusted his posture, as if nothing had happened, and calmly picked up his phone. His fingers moved slowly across the screen as he dialed the assistance line, a soft yet deliberate gesture. "Hello," he said, his voice steady. "I need immediate assistance at my seat, please." The flight attendant froze. Her smugness evaporated in an instant. She glanced around, unsure of how to react. She had just humiliated this man, torn his clothing in front of everyone, and now he was calling for help. It was a moment she hadn't prepared for. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to offer a lesson in humility, the plane's loudspeaker crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice rang out, cutting through the quiet tension. "We have an important announcement. Effective immediately, the new owner of this airline is sitting right here with us in the first-class section. We ask that you respect this individual, as we will be making changes to ensure a better experience for everyone on board." There was a brief, stunned silence in the cabin. The flight attendant's face drained of color as she stared at the man in front of her, her mouth slightly agape. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The man she had so harshly judged, this so-called poor passenger, was not only rich, but the new owner of the airline. She stood there, speechless, as the weight of her actions began to sink in. The passengers, who had been passive until now, exchanged shocked glances. Some even started whispering, processing the revelation. The man, now fully aware of the chaos his revelation had caused, stood up slowly. His eyes scanned the room with calm authority. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'm sorry if my appearance led anyone to think I don't belong here. But now that you know who I am, perhaps it's time to reassess how we treat others." The flight attendant, feeling small and ashamed, lowered her gaze. The realization of her error was overwhelming. She had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment, and now she had a lot to answer for. "I'm MrBeast," the man continued, his voice resonating in the quiet cabin. "And I'm not here to make a scene, but I do believe in respect for everyone, regardless of their appearance." He turned to the flight attendant, who was now visibly shaking. "I'm not angry," he said calmly, "but I do hope you'll remember this moment. Treating people with kindness and understanding goes a long way, and it starts with looking beyond what's on the outside. The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face flushed with embarrassment, her mind racing to find the right words. But there was nothing she could say to undo the damage she had caused. And then, without warning, the loudspeaker came to life again. "Attention all passengers. We would like to formally apologize to MrBeast for the unfortunate incident that occurred earlier. We are taking immediate action to ensure that this never happens again." The realization that the airline was now in the hands of the very man she had humiliated hit her like a tidal wave. Her body went cold as she turned towards him, still unable to find her voice. MrBeast, watching her struggle with her emotions, didn't seem upset. He wasn't the kind of man to use his power to crush others. Instead, he simply nodded, signaling that there was no need for further punishment. The passengers, still processing what had just occurred, started to clap. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from uncomfortable to one of quiet appreciation. Some passengers even stood up to applaud MrBeast, their faces reflecting admiration for how he had handled the situation. A few discreet selfies were taken, capturing the moment for posterity. The flight attendant stood frozen, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She couldn't even bring herself to look MrBeast in the eye, too ashamed of her actions. But MrBeast, ever the gentleman, broke the silence with a final piece of advice. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them," he said. "I hope that you'll consider this experience a chance for growth. And remember, never judge someone by the way they look or dress. The most important thing is what's inside." With that, he sat back down, his calm demeanor unshaken by the chaos around him. The flight attendant stood there for a moment longer, the applause echoing in her ears as she silently vowed to change. Her mind was racing, but deep down, she knew that this moment, this lesson, would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere was markedly different. The earlier tension had melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding among the passengers. They had witnessed something rare, an important lesson in humility, respect, and personal growth. And for the flight attendant, the reality of her actions had begun to sink in. She knew she had been given a second chance, and this time, she promised herself she would do better, be better. As the plane made its descent, the passengers disembarked with a renewed sense of awareness. Most had witnessed something far more important than just a flight. They had seen an example of dignity and grace in the face of arrogance. The flight attendant, still carrying the weight of her mistake, made her way off the plane last. She didn't look up at MrBeast or the passengers. Instead, she walked quietly, her head held a little lower, but her heart a little wiser. Before the flight attendant could react, the announcement system crackled again. "We'd like to apologize to MrBeast for the treatment he received earlier today. Please understand that our staff is not accustomed to such high-profile guests. However, we'll be taking immediate steps to ensure this kind of incident never happens again." The flight attendant, now fully aware of the magnitude of her mistake, approached MrBeast hesitantly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "MrBeast, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should never have judged you based on your appearance." MrBeast looked at her for a moment, the quiet stillness between them almost deafening. He could have easily reprimanded her, could have fired her on the spot. But instead, he chose to teach her something far more valuable. He sighed and spoke softly. "You know, it's easy to hate what you don't understand. But that's not the way forward. You should never judge a person based on their clothes or their appearance. People are much more than what they wear." The flight attendant's face softened as she absorbed his words. She felt a pang of guilt gnawing at her chest. It wasn't just a personal lesson she had learned, but a deeper reflection on her own biases. "You'll find that most of the people you look down on," MrBeast continued, "have something far more important than wealth. They have dignity. Treat everyone with respect. You'll be surprised at the kind of person they are." The passengers around them had been watching the interaction unfold, their phones now down as the weight of the moment sank in. It wasn't every day that such a powerful lesson was shared in such a personal way. Some passengers began clapping, appreciating MrBeast's grace and wisdom. A few even took selfies with him, eager to capture the moment. The flight attendant, still feeling the sting of embarrassment, nodded in understanding. "I'll remember that," she said, her voice barely audible. "I promise." "Good," MrBeast replied, his voice still calm, his gaze unwavering. "We all have room to grow. I hope you'll choose kindness from now on." As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. The flight attendant, now humbled, worked diligently, her earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet professionalism. She moved through the cabin with a newfound respect for every passenger, every individual. The rest of the flight went without incident. The man who had been wrongfully judged was no longer just a mystery. He was a person to be revered, his actions teaching a lesson far greater than any luxury or wealth. And for the flight attendant, the experience had transformed her. No longer would she make assumptions based on appearances. She had learned the hard way that true worth came from within, and that it was not for her to determine. The plane touched down, and as the passengers disembarked, many of them stopped to thank MrBeast for his wisdom. His calm demeanor and powerful message had left an impression on them, one they would carry with them long after the flight. As for the flight attendant, she walked off the plane with her head held a little lower, but with a heart that was just a little bit wiser. She had been given a second chance, and she would make sure to never forget the lesson she had learned, to treat everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of who they were or what they wore.